Welcome to Intesa San Paulo on Air, the English Language Insight series produced in conjunction with the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this, our 11th episode, I will be speaking with Tom Hale, a professor at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, to discuss how we manage long problems. Now, long problems are problems which span long time periods. We come across long problems all the time. How to plan for intergenerational wealth, how to manage long-term infrastructure investments like new transport networks or the building of new cities, and of course, how to manage and plan for climate change. It's easy to overlook or to ignore long problems. It's hard enough to deal with the issues affecting us today without having to add the complexity of considering what's right for our great-grandchildren. But decisions we make today matter, especially when it comes to some of the big societally important themes of our time. Today, I'm delighted to be able to discuss this with Tom, who is one of the leading thinkers in this space. Our focus, naturally, will be on climate, as this provides both a perfect petri dish on which to base our discussions, and is also the issue that Tom uses to frame his new book, published late last year, called Long Problems, The Climate Change and the Challenge of Governing Across Time. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much, Rupert. I'm speaking to you obviously about long-term problems, but I submit to you that many of the urgent crises we face around the world, and some people describe it as a polycrisis, are, if you drill down, actually connected to many long-term deeper drivers. And so getting our right thinking around how to deliver long-term change is actually, in some ways, the only way to deal with the mounting and increasingly complex crises we face in the short term. And I'm speaking to you today from the perspective of someone working in a school of government, trying to advise governments, and as a political scientist who studies how and why politics works the way it does. And a lot of the business people I engage with, particularly in the last year, and I'm curious if you agree, tend to point to politics as one of the biggest barriers, uncertainties, risks for what they're trying to do in their business. So I think this is an important time to come together to talk about this issue.
Thanks, Tom. So how should we best frame this issue to get the most out of our discussion today?
What I'm trying to do today, I think, can best be explained with a simple thought exercise. So I wanted you to, if I can, just kind of imagine yourself. This is a bit of a mental stretch, but please try. Imagine yourself as a molecule of carbon dioxide. So you're two oxygen atoms, you're one carbon atom. You are part of, say, maybe a dinosaur or a palm tree some number of millions of years ago. You stop being that thing, and when that organism dies, you then fall into a swamp perhaps, and over time, layers and layers and layers of other such organisms pile on top of you, and over millennia, you're slowly compressed and squished into what eventually becomes, say, coal. Then, a short time ago, just 250 years or so ago, someone, maybe in the north of England, digs you up, pops you into a furnace, and off you go, burst into 1,000 different molecules, thrown up a smokestack into the atmosphere, where you've been spinning around the planet for the last 250 years or so as a CO2 molecule. And in that time, you've seen huge transformations in human society. You've seen the Industrial Revolution, you've seen the rise of representative democracy, you've seen imperialism and colonialism, you've seen all sorts of transformations in society and in our politics. And as you're joined by increasingly more and more CO2 molecules, you see that you are actually going to be there for much time, and your colleagues, other CO2 molecules, are going to be there for many, many centuries to come. And this kind of long-term perspective, which is actually how a carbon atom might perceive the climate challenge, how it might see politics, is, I think, really instructive, because that's the kind of scale of the problem we have to face. And the idea that we might understand the politics of climate change today for a fleeting moment surely should give us the humility to realize that we're not going to necessarily have the same sort of politics today as we do into the next centuries and millennia as this problem plays out. So that kind of juxtaposition between the scale of the problems, the temporal scale of the problems we're trying to address, and how our human systems work is my motivation for the book I'm going to base my talk on today, which is called Long Problems.
That is such an interesting and powerful place to start. Giving words to the inanimate object that is the focus of all our work, the object that we are, of course, trying to limit or eradicate, to explain how a carbon atom might view what is happening to them through the lens of thousands of years beautifully frames the long-term nature of this issue. You start your book framing the issue around defining the problem, before moving on to governing the problem, and finally ending with some proposed solutions.
So let me begin with the idea of what are long problems? What do we mean by this? And I think any problem has a kind of length, and long ones I would propose are those whose causes and effects span more than one human generation. So a cause of a problem, you can think about something like, for example, I just gave, climate change is caused by greenhouse gases, and particularly the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And its effects are things like a warming temperature, and then the knock-on effects of that, like drought or flood or sea level rise or other kinds of dynamics like that. But of course, this is one example of quite a long problem. Another example people often can point to is urban development, planning. How do we build cities, and how do we move in them, and how do we use them? And obviously, sitting here in the city of Oxford, which is a beautiful city, but one built for a certain organization of society, a certain way of getting around, a certain way of heating and cooling, and all the kinds of things buildings need to do, which has now implications for how we manage that going forward. Another long problem that people often are thinking about these days is around pensions. How do we sustain systems of welfare for across generations? Systems were, by and large, in the OECD countries set up at a time when jobs looked a certain way, lifespans looked a certain way, people's expectations about what their work-life balance would be looked a certain way. And now it's all changed radically as people have much more flexible styles of working, or live longer, or pensions tend to be evolving. So this is the kinds of long problems that we have to think about in a way. One that I'm thinking about a lot these days is actually the idea of government efficiency. So I sit in a school of government, and we talk to many governments, not just the ones in the headlines, about how they can save money and deliver more value for their people, because that's what every government in a world of interest rates being what they are is trying to think about. And many generations of people have failed to address issues around debt and rising deficits because they haven't invested enough in prevention. One example, my own country, the United States, spent something like $5 trillion in direct payments to taxpayers from the COVID-19 crisis. In the previous 10 years, it spent something like, it's hard to count exactly what you mean, but on the order of something like a few $1 billion on pandemic prevention. So here's a great example where a lack of prevention led to a huge lack of efficiency.
So these are extremely challenging issues, involving long-term thinking, but with immediate consequences on our actions. How should we start to think about governing these long-term problems? And who should we look to as the main actors in this game?
What I try to do in my book is explain why through the lens of the discipline that I work in, which is political science, political economy. And that's really a study of how political power is built, how people wield political power, how different interests contest different outcomes through institutions and other kinds of forms of contestation to get the outcomes they want. And I tried in the book to identify a few of go beyond the simple intuition that short-termism is rampant and therefore long-term thinking is harder, to try to be more precise about what are the challenges of governing these kinds of challenges.
So we've been here before. In 1992, world leaders gathered in Rio de Janeiro to promise, through international law, that they would prevent dangerous changes to the Earth's atmosphere.
That was the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change language. It said we were going to stop this problem in its tracks. And here we are, about to go back to Brazil this year for the 30th Conference of the Parties of this organization to try to deliver on that promise. And they've not succeeded, and despite the ongoing pledges and attempts to do so, and the increasingly clear science, that's the imperative to act, the increasingly supportive economic situation where many of the things we thought would be really hard to do, like generate power from the sun or the wind, are actually much, much easier to do than they ever were. These people could even have imagined. And despite all those changes, we're still not making the kind of progress we want. So that's the kind of dilemma I'm trying to diagnose.
So what's the problem?
There are three barriers that I think are worth focusing our attention on. The first I call the shadow interest problem, which is the simple idea that people who are affected by future things aren't here yet because they don't exist. They haven't been born yet. And so they can't act in politics in the way that even very marginalized people can act in politics if they happen to exist. And this comes from the insight in political science that many of the big changes in politics or solutions that come through the policy process emerge when a group of people or a set of interests, corporates or population groups, feel something is hurting them. They're actually reacting against some sort of pressure or pain that's bearing down on them. And so this kind of reaction against things they don't like is an important driver for any kind of political outcome. And if those people who are primarily affected by something like climate change, and of course climate has impacts today, but those people who are being impacted them today are being affected by choices made by previous generations, and we're in the current generation affecting the choices of people who come after us. Those people aren't here yet, so they can't raise their voice in politics. We can only see their interests sort of dimly, like this picture of the British Parliament. And that means that they have much less effect on politics than someone who is alive today, even if they have very little political power. So this gap between who is affected by a problem and their ability to act is the first barrier that really saps political power from any kind of long-term problem. The second the second barrier that long problems pose to governance is the problem of institutional lag, which is again a simple intuition that comes from our literature that says, problems tend to change as they go forward in time, but institutions tend to stick. This is the technical political science language. We say institutions are sticky, which means if you have a law or an organization or a policy or regulation, it only really has effect to the extent it has some durability in time. And indeed, if it's more flexible, more malleable, it's not really a very powerful way to shape behavior, which is what institutions try to do. But problems, as they evolve, of course, change. And as time goes on, they change more and more. And if you look at the climate challenge, this is a really, I think, clear example of this, where in 1992, when those people I showed you in Brazil were meeting, people really thought about climate change as essentially a pollution problem. How do you get fewer of this stuff coming out of pipes to come out of those pipes? And as time has gone on, I think we have understood climate change is much more about an economic transformation problem. It's much more about managing the impacts of climate change, not just preventing climate change from happening, but treating the climate change that does happen, which is itself a set of long problems. And it's maybe even something about how do we think about dealing with some massive interventions in the Earth's climate, like trying to suck carbon dioxide back out of the air, or perhaps even trying to reflect some of the sun's power back into space. Those are the sort of ways people are increasingly thinking about climate change. And that's not what the institution we set up in 1992 was ever designed to do. So it took decades for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN talks, to even recognize that adaptation to climate change, dealing with its impacts, was an important topic that we should focus on. And still today, governments don't have in place suitable plans for adaptation. One of my students is looking at municipal adaptation plans in cities in the United States. And it's kind of shocking to find how big, powerful, rich cities that have huge capacities still don't have in place plans to just manage things we know are very likely to happen or indeed happening before our eyes. Fires in Los Angeles, one very stunning example. So this is a big problem. But the final barrier I want to point us to is something I call the early action paradox, which is maybe the most vexatious of these three different barriers. And this is the idea that we need to act before the effects are known or salient, because by definition, a long problem is one where causes are in the past and effects are in the future. So those effects are still a little bit uncertain or a little bit under the radar before they take place. And it's really hard for politics to work in those conditions because, well, for various reasons. Uncertainty is something that makes it very easy to oppose any kind of proposal. Think about, for example, the long time it took governments to wake up to the challenges, the costs they were paying on tobacco, or on different kinds of carcinogenic chemicals, or on massive rain, or on any of these problems where there's quite a lot of technocratic science needed to go into figuring out what the actual effect is before a path forward was clear. Under those conditions, it's really hard to generate action. Now, marry that to a set of issues which are, because they don't really exist yet in their full form, much less salient than some of the other crises you might face. So salience is like this magical thing when you have it, everything is possible, you get everyone's attention, you get the issue on the agenda of the senator or the MP or the president or the prime minister. And when you don't have salience, you're basically alone in the wilderness. And so when you have this combination of low certainty and low salience, it's really hard to make any kind of positive change. Instead, when you have those conditions, you actually empower the people who are most opposed to doing anything to block any kind of action, because under conditions of low salience and high uncertainty, it's always easy to say, no, let's not act too hastily. Let's do another study. No, do we really know about that? No, it's another issue that's more important. Let's prioritize that. That's always going to be true under these conditions. And so for blockers or obstructors, it's very easy to act. So for all these reasons, we should expect action to be less than what would be optimal from a social perspective, or indeed desirable from a kind of common sense perspective.
That's super helpful. Our focus should be on solving three critical interrelated problems. The problem that people in the future have no agency or ability to shape decisions that we make today, what you call the shadow interest problem. The problem that institutions that we create today to deal with long problems themselves become outdated as the problem structure develops over time. And the early action problem, the fact that we all need to act long before the effects are known if we're to intervene for impact. And the issues where these problems show up exist beyond climate. Think of pensions, think of our increasing resistance to life-saving medicines, or, as we've discussed in previous episodes, the accumulating problem of space junk. So what are governments doing about these problems?
The good news, and this is now the thing I really think is exciting to talk about, is that if we look, we can find lots of examples of where different kinds of governments are putting in place actually effective solutions to long problems. And these aren't silver bullets, these aren't panaceas. I don't want to lie to you that there's some sort of magical elixir out there that we can pour over this problem and make it go away. That's obviously not the case. But there's a lot we can do. One way, for example, is through representation, giving people of the future a voice. Not too far from here, over in Wales, there's an early example of this through the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, which was set up in 2015. It's a person created by the Welsh Parliament to talk to people about why any given policy decision should maybe incorporate a bit more thinking about people, Welsh people in this case, of the future. So it's an advocacy voice for the future generations trying to solve that shadow interest problem. And it can really work. So the Welsh Health Service, which is like the Welsh branch of the UK's NHS, National Health Service, has had for years a kind of desire to invest more in prevention, healthy lifestyles, early screening, that kind of thing, because they knew it would save money. And for years, it was really hard to make that change, because even though you know it's the right thing to do, as anyone who's talked to a doctor can tell you, it's not always easy to act on that advice. By having an actual person whose job it was to really drive that change by doing public consultations, by having a kind of voice within the Welsh Senate, by having various kinds of policy agenda setting roles that was given institutionally, that person was actually able to help the health service deliver some interventions that invested more in prevention than they ever had done before. And this is, I think, a really important example.
That's extremely interesting. And I know that in your book, you bring out many examples of other countries who are also baking into their political systems bodies responsible for looking after the interests of future generations, including Finland's Parliamentary Committee for the Future, the Maltese Guardian of Future Generations, and the UAE's Ministry of Cabinet Affairs and the Future. Now, you move on in the book to discuss a second idea, that of trusteeship. What do you mean by that?
Trusteeship is another way to go beyond just giving the future a voice, but actually giving people with a longer term time horizon some real decision-making power and tying our hands and insulating those decision makers from some of the pressures of the present. I'll come back to this one in a second, because it's the example I want to share with you from California, where I was a few weeks ago. But as I say, we use these kind of tools all the time in constitutional democracies. We have courts, we have central banks, and we think these kinds of institutions work precisely because they're a little bit insulated from political leaders, elected officials, or others. And we give them mandates, we give them lots of control, so they're not sort of anti-democratic. They're operating to help the government deliver what it needs to deliver to meet what people expect it to do. But they work precisely because they're a little bit insulated. And actually, we see central banks and courts as two of the institutions that are taking some of the most interesting and high impact decisions around climate change. Just last year, the South Korean Constitutional Court was the latest one to order the government to set a higher climate change target, because it said its target was unfair to future Koreans for not taking account of their interests sufficiently.
The core idea that Tom puts forward is that we need institutions strong enough to tie our hands into the future, giving real power to such institutions oriented towards action over the longer term. Now, these already exist across different parts of the world. The 1970 Clean Air Act in the US, for example, gives significant authority to the Environmental Protection Agency today to set standards around air quality. And in Europe, the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, while a weaker form of constraint, did create the fiscal rules by which all member states must act. So what's the third idea? What other mechanisms could you propose that might help us better consider long problems?
By extending time horizons. And governments are doing this all around the world. in the form of having more participatory citizen assemblies on different issues. You might say, well, that's more about democracy or about deliberation, not about time per se. But actually, one of the really interesting research findings that comes across is that when you take citizens into an environment where you say, all right, now forget about all these politicians for a second, think about what that you want for your town, think about the future of this place, and how we should, say, set a budget or think about a key policy challenge like climate change or something else like that. People actually begin adopting a much longer time horizon. You can really measure this by comparing people's preferences going in and out of these kinds of citizen assemblies or citizen jury type institutions. So I'm not saying we should get away with our elected representatives and have only kind of town hall meetings all the time, but by making more use of these kinds of more participatory, direct, deliberative democracy tools, we can actually inject a bit of long-termism into people's thinking.
So getting us all as citizens involved may in fact help us deal more fairly and effectively with long problems. On top of that, we need, according to Tom, endurance and better goal setting, more reflexive governance where we bake in the adaptability and the evolution of institutions, and include specific policy triggers that force us to review and update where needed. So what's the best example that you can tell us about?
One of the institutions that is closest, I think, to a kind of climate change trustee institution is something called the California Air Resources Board, which is the main body through which the state of California sets its climate change and delivers its climate change targets. It was created by then Governor Ronald Reagan in the 1960s to address the problem of smog. But over time, its effectiveness allowed it to, or encouraged the state to use it for more and more things, including from the 1990s forward, its climate change targets. And so when the California legislature passes a target, it's typically a very small piece of legislation, like 3 or 4 pages, I think was the last one, which says, here's what we want to achieve. And then it delegates a lot of the question of how to achieve that to this quite independent trustee-like institution, a kind of quasi-central bank for climate change, if you will. It's governed by a board. The board is appointed for 6-year terms, longer than the governor's term, I should say. And it has lots of built-in sort of voices from community groups or industry groups or other kinds of stakeholders. And it's the thing that runs the California emissions trading system. It sets auto standards for the state. It's the thing that actually delivers all the climate policy that's made California a real leader globally on reducing emissions from its economy. And so there's various reasons why this works. Of course, one of them is the political consensus California has enjoyed, even across different administrations of different political parties, for action on climate change. But it also is working because it's able to move beyond the short term and actually think about what would a 20-year strategy for changing the state's power mix look like? What would a 20-year strategy for changing the way cars operate in the state look like? I think that kind of installation, even though nested in democratic politics, is very much at the heart of its success. So just to prove we can do this well. Here in the UK, we have a body called the UK Climate Change Committee, which is also quite independent from government, statutory body created to advise government on how it could meet its climate change targets, but it doesn't have that operational implementation and decision-making capacity that CARB has. So it's more of a step in this direction as opposed to a fully fledged thing.
That is a great US example. And of course, for us here in the UK, particularly good to play that forward with the UK Climate Change Committee if we address the lack of any operational capability that would give it the power that it needs to address long problems effectively. I want to close our talk today, if we can, on the politics of climate change and short-termism, and why, despite all that, you are optimistic.
So if you think about the politics of climate change from this big multi-historical perspective, it's sort of obvious to me that politics will change in that time. And if you think about some of the big impacts we've witnessed recently, whether I just mentioned the fires in Los Angeles, but think about droughts or floods or heat waves or other kinds of effects of climate change that we're all experiencing, you can see a really, really dangerous scenario where the impacts of climate change force us to more short-termism and not away from some of the prevention and toward treatment. If you're a mayor of a city, and the city has been having a nighttime temperature over 4 degrees Celsius for the past week, are you going to spend your city budget on, say, climate-saving renewable energy, or are you going to spend it on climate-destroying air conditioners? Obviously, you're going to have to do the latter. And so political incentives here aren't positive from where we could end up if you can see the spiral playing out. But I think the key point I want to make in the book is that the choice actually sits with us to think about something different. If we assume that politics are the thing that are going to help us drive toward this problem or push us away from it, those are not impregnable to our intervention. Politics plays out on the field of institutions, in the fields of human design. And right now, that field is tipped against any kind of long-term position on climate change, on pensions, on infrastructure, on any issue we care about. But it doesn't have to be. And if we can increasingly invest in tipping that field a bit more toward the long term by these kind of putting in place a whole range of these kinds of interventions we've been talking about, I think we'll have a much more, we won't always struggle to make the long-term matter. It'll be more built in, more natural. It'll be part of what we assume politics work, how politics should work. And so the perspective of the carbon molecule is really important, I think, because it shows us that things we think of as constraints are, over a long time frame, actually variables. We can affect them, right? And so I think that's where, for businesses today, for people, for polities, for communities, thinking more creatively and, dare I say, with a little bit of optimism about how we can affect the structures through which we make decisions can actually show us a way forward on this or other long problems.
Thank you, Tom, for a really brilliant analysis and for taking us through the themes in your book, which, by the way, I heartily recommend. But more importantly, for providing a roadmap as to how policymakers and institutions could work together to bake in the structures and governance required to ensure that the interests of future generations can be carefully considered and acted upon by all of us here today. The prize, whether that be better retirement planning, more planetary responsibility, or ensuring we avoid space becoming Earth's dustbin, is surely worth the effort.